"Look at that one." "Officer," Brett Danner muttered into his coffee cup, his pale blue eyes narrowing behind the cruiser's windshield, his voice carrying the particular contempt of a man who had already made up his mind before he finished the sentence. Bet he wandered in from the highway. Nobody answered him. He was alone in the car. He said it anyway. The park was called Halcyon Pines Lakeside Reserve, and on a mid-October morning at 8:15, with frost still needling the grass and the oak trees burning copper and amber above the water's edge, it was the kind of place that made people slow down and breathe differently. The lake caught the early light and broke it into small golden plates that drifted and reformed with every ripple. The air smelled of cold water and dead leaves and something that was almost but not quite peace. Raymond Elias Cole had been coming to this bench for 5 years every morning that his body allowed it, which was most mornings. The bench sat near the water's edge on the south side of the lake, a wrought iron frame with a wooden slat seat worn smooth by 10,000 mornings of strangers and their thoughts. Raymond had made it his own not by any claim or declaration, but simply by arriving day after day until the bench knew him the way a good chair knows a body. The particular angle of the lower back, the distribution of weight, that means this person is not leaving any time soon. He was 69 years old, and he looked every year of it in the way that men who have carried real weight look their age. Not poorly, not sadly, but with a kind of earned heaviness that sat in the lines of his dark face and the careful slowness of his movements. His hair was silver and close-cropped beneath a gray wool cap that had been washed so many times it had taken on the color of old snow. His field jacket was olive drab, military-style, faded at the elbows and collar from decades of wear, and his corduroy trousers were loose and practical in the way of a man who had long since stopped dressing for anyone's approval. His hands were large and weathered and very still, except when they moved into the worn canvas bag on his lap to pull out a handful of cracked corn. He tossed the corn in a slow, practiced arc toward the frost-stiffened grass at the water's edge. A congregation of mallards, 9 of them this morning, moved toward the scattered kernels with the purposeful waddling urgency that ducks bring to everything involving food. Raymond watched them with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else, something quieter and more private than either. He knew each of the ducks, not in a sentimental way, not the way people name goldfish and talk to houseplants, but in the way that you come to know any creature whose patterns you observe long enough and carefully enough that individual behavior starts to separate from the general blur. The aggressive male who always pushed to the front he thought of as Reynolds. The cautious hen who waited until the crowd thinned before approaching he called Patterson. There was a young female who always circled twice before committing to any particular colonel who had no particular name but whom he recognized without one. And then there was Amos. Amos was a large male mallard, older than most of the others by the look of him, with a damaged left foot that had healed at a bad angle years before Raymond ever started coming here, giving him a rolling, effortful gait that was both undignified and somehow magnificent. While the rest of the flock clustered at the water's edge or skittered back when something startled them, Amos stayed close to the bench. Not right at Raymond's feet. He was a duck, not a dog, and kept his autonomy in the way of wild things, but closer than the others, staying at the near edge of the scattered corn while his flockmates jostled and honked further out. Raymond always tossed an extra handful in Amos's direction, slightly separate from the main scatter without making a production of it and without looking directly at the bird, the way you offer something to a proud creature when you don't want to make it feel accommodated. In the breast pocket of his field jacket, the corner of a small laminated card was just visible above the worn fabric of the pocket edge, a small rectangle of institutional blue with white lettering, the specific shade and format of a federal identification document, though the words themselves were hidden inside the fold of the pocket. Raymond had carried it there for 12 years by pure habit, the same way a man carries a pocket knife he no longer uses but has always carried, and his thumb pressed against it now, briefly unconsciously, as he reached into the canvas bag again. Evelyn Marsh came down the walking path from the north entrance at the same time she always did, her small terrier Biscuit trotting ahead of her on a red leash, both of them moving with the easy familiarity of creatures who had made this circuit so many times it lived in their muscles rather than their minds. Evelyn was 71, trim and upright, and she wore her silver hair in a style that had not changed in 20 years, because it had been right 20 years ago and time had not improved on it. "Raymond," she said as she passed, lifting one hand in greeting. "Evelyn," he said in the same tone. Morning's currency, quiet and sufficient. Biscuit looked at the ducks and experienced the full philosophical conflict of small dogs confronted with birds that outweigh them, then thought better of it and trotted on. Evelyn slowed slightly. She had noticed in the way that women who have managed difficult institutions for 30 years notice things: the patrol cruiser idling near the north entrance, the pale face behind the windshield angled toward the bench. She looked at Raymond. He gave a very small, very slow shake of his head. She continued walking, but her pace did not fully return to what it had been. 200 yards away, Brett Danner set down his coffee and put the cruiser in drive. Brett Danner had wanted to be a police officer since he was 19 years old, and the reason he had wanted it was simple and had not changed in 9 years. He had grown up being the kind of boy that other boys felt comfortable pushing around. And the moment he understood that a badge and a gun and the legal authority to give orders to other people existed as a package you could acquire through a process available to anyone willing to pass the physical and the written exam, something in him had locked onto that fact with the grip of a drowning man finding a rope. He was 28 now, 5'11", and thick-set, with a blonde buzz cut so precise it looked like it had been applied with a machine rather than a hand, and pale blue eyes that sat in a permanent expression of evaluating suspicion, scanning and filing everything they encountered, according to a taxonomy that had been built privately and defended loudly in his own mind for years. He kept himself in good physical condition through a regimen that was more punishment than fitness, and he wore his uniform and duty belt with the particular care of a man for whom they represented something beyond their functional purpose, something closer to identity, to a self that had been constructed around the authority they conferred. In 5 years of active service across 2 previous departments, Brett Danner had accumulated 6 formal complaints. This was the number that appeared in his official personnel file, transferred from department to department in documents that used language like proactive policing style and assertive community presence in ways that were technically accurate and thoroughly misleading. The real number, the incidents that were never formally reported, the stops that ended with a civilian walking away, shaking the searches that found nothing and apologized to no one, was something else entirely. Complaint number 1 had come from a 16-year-old black boy named Deshaun Briggs, who had been walking home from school through a neighborhood that Danner had decided on the basis of criteria he could not have articulated in a court of law, did not belong to people like Deshaun. Danner had thrown the boy to the ground on hot summer asphalt and held him there with a knee in his back for 11 minutes while backup arrived, and Deshaun had not resisted because Deshaun had been paying enough attention to the world to understand what resistance would cost him. The complaint had been dismissed for insufficient evidence. The scar on Deshaun's chin from where his face met the pavement had not been dismissed, but scars were not evidence in the language of internal affairs investigations. Complaint number 2 had come from a 34-year-old Latina woman named Carmen Reyes, who had been sitting in a grocery store parking lot in a car that Danner had decided looked suspicious, which, in the grammar of his instincts, meant that the car was too new for the neighborhood and the driver was the wrong color for the car. He had searched the vehicle in front of her 2 children, ages 6 and 8, and had found nothing because there was nothing to find, and had driven away without a word of apology or explanation, leaving Carmen to explain to a 6-year-old why the police sometimes did things that didn't make any sense. The complaint had been dismissed for insufficient evidence. Complaint number 3 through 6 followed the same architecture with different names and different details. All of them dismissed for the same reasons, and each dismissal had confirmed for Danner the lesson that the system had been teaching him from the beginning. The badge protected you. The institution protected itself, and the people on the receiving end of his judgment were not in any practical sense the people the system was designed to protect. His transfer to Halcyon Pines 6 months ago had been presented to him as a lateral reassignment, a fresh start, a quieter assignment that would suit his experience. What it actually was, a managed ejection from a department that had grown tired of the paperwork while not yet being willing to do the harder work of accountability, was understood by everyone involved and spoken about by no one. Danner had told himself it was a promotion. The absence of contradicting voices had let him maintain that belief. What he had found in Halcyon Pines was boredom of a particular and aggravating kind. The calls were noise complaints and fence line disputes and the occasional wellness check on an elderly resident who had not picked up their newspaper. There was no action, no resistance, no opportunity for the authority he had built his identity around to mean anything in practice. And so, over the past 3 months, Danner had begun manufacturing his own opportunities, cruising the affluent streets and the quiet parks of this $2 million median zip code, looking for people whose presence failed the test he had never written down but applied with absolute consistency. His sergeant, Lou Ferrara, had spoken to him about it twice. Twice Danner had nodded and said yes, sir, and heard beneath the words the softness of a man who had gotten comfortable and mistaken comfort for wisdom. Now, watching the old man on the bench through the cruiser windshield, Danner felt the familiar electric current of a stop that had already been decided before it began. Worn clothing, no visible vehicle, elderly black male alone sitting on a bench at 8:15 in the morning in a park where the nearest house cost $2 million and its owner would not have looked like this man not in any clothing. The canvas bag on the man's lap. Unknown contents. Danner's eyes moved to the ducks gathering at the man's feet and registered them as irrelevant. His eyes moved to the small rectangle of something blue and official-looking barely visible at the man's breast pocket, and registered it as probably a bus pass. His hand moved without conscious thought to check his sidearm, then to the taser on his left hip, then back to the steering wheel. He put the cruiser in drive. The tires ground against the gravel path with a sound that scattered the ducks instantly from the water's edge in a burst of wings and indignant noise. Amos did not move. Raymond heard the cruiser before he turned around, which was not a skill or a talent, but simply the result of 41 years of law enforcement becoming so thoroughly embedded in his nervous system that certain sounds, the particular acoustic weight of a Crown Victoria engine, the specific crunch of department-issued tires on a gravel surface, the subtle shift in the ambient atmosphere that preceded authority approaching, bypassed his conscious mind entirely and registered as physical fact before he could have said how he knew. He did not turn around. He reached into the canvas bag, pulled out another handful of corn, and tossed it toward the water's edge with the same slow arc as the previous handful and the one before that. His pulse was steady. He could feel it at his wrist where his hand rested on the edge of the bag, and it was doing what it had learned to do over 4 decades of situations that required it to be steady. It was being steady. Not because he was not aware of what was coming. He was completely precisely aware of what was coming, but because awareness and composure were not the same thing, and he had spent enough years in harm's way to know that composure was not the absence of fear, but the discipline of not letting fear make decisions. There were 2 scars visible at the collar of his field jacket when he turned his head to the side following the trajectory of the corn he had just tossed. One high on his left shoulder, one lower on the right side of his neck. Both old, both faded to the particular silver brown of healed tissue that has had decades to settle into the surrounding skin. He had not thought about either of them in years. They were simply part of the landscape of his body, the way an old house has settled into its foundation and stopped registering its own architecture. His thumb pressed without intention or awareness against the laminated card in his breast pocket. He had done this for 12 years every time something that felt like the beginning of trouble arrived in his vicinity. He could not have told you why. The card had never protected him from anything. It was simply the last thing he touched before things got difficult, the way some men touch a religious object and some men touch a scar, and the gesture meant something his conscious mind had never had to articulate. The ducks had scattered when the cruiser's tires hit the gravel. All of them except Amos, who remained at the near edge of the corn scatter. His damaged foot settled at its characteristic angle, eating with the unhurried focus of a creature that had long ago decided not to organize its life around threat assessment. Raymond watched Amos for a moment, then placed both hands flat and visible on his thighs and waited. The weight that lived in Raymond Cole's body was not the weight of age, though age had added its own layers. It was the weight of 41 years of decisions that could not be undone, only lived with. The weight of the officer he had fired in 2004, whose daughter had sent him a letter 3 years later, saying she understood now and thanked him. The weight of the officer he had not fired in 1997, who had then done something Raymond would spend the rest of his life measuring himself against. The weight of the families he had sat with in hospital waiting rooms, and the families he had stood before in dress uniform with a folded flag, and words that he had said so many times they had carved grooves in him like water on stone. He had retired 5 years ago, and in the first year he had tried to fill the silence with golf and fishing and travel, and none of it had worked, because the silence wasn't really silence. It was the accumulated noise of 4 decades trying to find somewhere to go. And golf courses and fishing boats and hotel rooms were not architecturally suited to that particular noise. The ducks had worked, or rather the bench had worked, and the ducks had been there, and over time, the specific act of coming here with a canvas bag of cracked corn and sitting with Amos and Reynolds and Patterson and the rest of them had become the structure that held the mornings together. He had wanted anonymity, which was something he had never fully had during his working life, and Halcyon Pines had given him that nobody here knew his name beyond the small circle of morning regulars like Evelyn, and nobody here needed anything from him, and nobody looked at him and saw the chief instead of just an old man with a bag of corn and a favorite bench. He had thought he was done with situations like this one. He had thought that was what retirement meant. The footsteps crossing the frost-stiffened grass were heavy and deliberate, each one landing with the extra weight of a man who wanted his approach announced, who had learned early that the sound of boots was itself a form of authority. Raymond turned. He did it slowly with both hands remaining flat and visible on his thighs, and he looked at Brett Danner for the first, and he suspected most important time. His eyes swept the younger man in one unhurried pass-age posture, hand position, near the sidearm nameplate at the chest badge number below it, and filed everything they found with the automatic precision of a man who had been reading other men in uniforms for longer than this one had been alive. Badge number 3312. Nameplate Danner. Raymond took a slow breath through his nose. The corn bag sat on the bench beside him. Amos ate. The morning light came off the lake in slow gold plates. He was ready. "This park is for residents," Danner said, stopping 6 feet from the bench with his thumbs hooked behind his duty belt, and his chest arranged into the posture he had practiced, the one that was supposed to communicate that the conversation had a predetermined endpoint, and that endpoint was compliance. "We don't want people coming from outside the area sitting around dumping food all over the grass. It makes a mess, and it attracts pests." He said the last word looking directly at Raymond in a way that was not ambiguous about what category of pest he had in mind. Raymond looked at him for a moment without speaking, the way a man looks at something he is assessing rather than reacting to, and then he said, "Public park. County taxes." Danner blinked. He had expected at minimum a defensive explanation, some version of, "I'm not doing anything wrong, officer. I live just over on Maple. I come here every morning. I have a right to be here." The automatic self-justification of a person who felt the need to justify their own existence to a badge. He had not expected 2 words flat and factual as a weather report. "I can see what you're doing," Danner said, letting his eyes move over Raymond's worn jacket and baggy corduroys with a deliberateness that was meant to communicate a judgment being formed in real time, though in fact the judgment had been formed 200 yards away through a windshield. "The question is whether you have any business being here. Residents only. Open to all citizens," Raymond said. He gestured once with one hand toward the scattered corn on the grass. Cracked corn. Wildlife. That's littering. Raymond said nothing. The silence had a quality that Danner found immediately irrationally irritating, the quality of a man who has decided that certain statements don't merit a response, which implied a ranking of statements and of the people who made them that Danner had not consented to. "I want to see your ID," Danner said, his voice dropping into the register he used for this, the one that communicated that the conversation had moved past the stage where options were being discussed. Right now. "On what grounds?" Raymond said. Danner's jaw tightened. "What legal grounds?" Raymond said. "For the identification demand." "What are they?" It was not asked aggressively. It was not asked with the performative defiance of someone trying to make a scene, which was what Danner had been trained to recognize and respond to. It was asked the way a man asks a question he genuinely wants answered but already knows the answer to, and the combination of those two things. The calm and the knowledge behind it produced in Danner's chest the specific heat of being underestimated by someone he had already decided was beneath him. "I don't explain the law to people." "I stop," Danner said. "No crime here," Raymond said. "No legal basis." He turned back to the canvas bag on the bench, reached in, and produced another handful of corn, which he tossed in a slow arc toward the water's edge, as if the conversation had reached a natural pause. On the walking path, 30 yards behind Danner, Evelyn Marsh had stopped. Biscuit sat at her feet reading the situation with the clarity of small animals who are unencumbered by the social obligation to pretend everything is fine. Evelyn's right hand had moved to her cardigan pocket and found her phone and brought it out and was holding it at her side. Not raised, not recording yet, but positioned in the way of someone who has decided that positioning matters. Raymond noticed this. A single slow blink in Evelyn's direction, nothing more. Danner moved closer, closing the distance from 6 feet to 4, the deliberate invasion of personal space that was one of the tools in his enforcement vocabulary. The physical assertion of presence as pressure. His right hand migrated from his duty belt to hover near the butt of his sidearm, not gripping it, just touching it the way a man touches a weapon when he wants you to be aware that it exists. "This is your last opportunity to produce identification voluntarily," Danner said, his voice flattening into something that lived just below a threat. "After this, I start writing citations. Littering, loitering, creating a public nuisance." He paused. "Or worse." The words, "or worse," went into the cold morning air and stayed there. Raymond raised one eyebrow. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but it communicated in the way that certain minimal expressions communicate things that paragraphs of speech cannot, that the threat had been received and categorized and found structurally deficient. Or worse, based on what Raymond said. Danner's right boot toe tapped once against the frost-stiffened grass. He was not aware that he did this when his patience ran out. He had done it since childhood, and nobody had ever told him. "Based on the fact that I'm standing here and you're sitting there and I have a badge and you're pushing your luck with someone who doesn't have to give you any more chances," Danner said, and the sentence had started with the shape of authority and ended with something closer to the sound of a man who could feel the situation not going the way he expected and was not sure what to do about that. Raymond reached into the canvas bag again, tossed another handful. Amos moved to the near corn and ate. The ducks further out honked and jostled. The morning light continued to move across the lake in slow gold plates. "No crime here," Officer Raymond said without turning. "Nothing to produce." Danner stepped forward until he was 2 feet away and stopped. He was close enough that Raymond could hear his breathing, which was slightly elevated, and smell the coffee on his breath, which was cold now and slightly bitter, and register the particular quality of the silence that Danner was trying to fill with his own presence, and finding that it was not filling. A second jogger had stopped on the path. A man with a golden retriever had paused near the tree line. The morning witnesses were accumulating in the quiet way of people who slow down when they sense that something is happening that they have not yet decided whether to be part of. "You know what your problem is?" Danner said, and his voice had shed the performance of official language and arrived somewhere more personal and therefore more revealing. Your problem is you think that sitting there with that attitude puts you on some kind of equal footing with me. It doesn't. I am standing here with a badge and a gun and the authority of the state of this county and this municipality behind every word I say to you, and you are sitting on a bench in a park that you don't have any verified right to be sitting in. And I am telling you for the last time to show me your identification before I make this morning a great deal more complicated for both of us." Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No grounds." 2 words, not delivered with defiance, not delivered with fear, not delivered with the performing for an audience quality of civil disobedience that Danner had been trained to recognize and suppress. Just 2 words, factual and complete, the way you say no available when someone asks for something that doesn't exist. The color started at Danner's collar. It moved upward through his jaw and into his cheeks in a slow tide that had nothing to do with the cold, and everything to do with the specific experience of a man who had built an entire interior architecture around the idea that his authority was absolute meeting, for possibly the first time in his professional life someone who simply did not accept that premise. His blonde buzz cut was damp at the temples. He was cold. It was 41 degrees, and his temples were damp. The right boot toe tapped twice against the grass, then stopped. "You think this is funny?" Danner said. Raymond looked at him. "No. You think you're making a point. You think you're proving something right now." Raymond said nothing. This was in its own way worse than the 2-word answers. The 2-word answers at least engaged the shape of a conversation. The silence was something else entirely. Not the silence of a man who had run out of things to say, but the silence of a man who had decided that what was being said to him didn't require an answer. And the distinction between those 2 kinds of silence was the difference between a door that won't open and a wall that has no door. "I am the law out here," Danner said, and the sentence came out a half register louder than he had intended, as if volume were a substitute for the authority that wasn't landing the way it was supposed to. "Out here in this park, in this neighborhood, I am what makes things work the way they work. And when I tell someone to produce identification, they produce identification. That is not a suggestion. That is not a request. That is the way this works." Raymond turned his head and looked at Danner with a steady, unhurried directness that had no anger in it and no submission and no performance of any kind. And for a moment, Danner had the disorienting experience of being looked at by someone who appeared to be making an entirely different kind of calculation than the one Danner was used to people making in his presence. Not how do I get out of this or how do I comply fast enough, but something closer to, I see you, and I have seen many things like you, and I know exactly how this works and how it ends. "I'm going to manufacture charges," Danner said louder now. "Littering. Loitering. I've got a public nuisance, I've got an uncooperative subject, I've got whatever I need to make this more than a conversation." "Is that what you want?" Raymond said. Nothing for a long moment. Then, with the quiet of someone making a decision that has already been made, he said, "Do what you have to do." This was not defiance. It was something more permanent than defiance. It was the statement of a man who had decided what he was willing to lose and had already accepted the cost, and it landed on Danner with the weight of something he did not have the framework to process. Danner stepped forward and his hand came off his duty belt and closed on the shoulder of Raymond's field jacket. Not a full grab, not yet. The full commitment of a physical arrest, but a gripping, a claiming of space, a declaration of physical dominance through contact. His fingers digging into the worn olive fabric with the instinctive force of a man who had always gotten what he wanted from this gesture. Raymond did not flinch. He did not pull away. His posture did not change in any visible way, and yet something in the quality of his stillness shifted, became something different from passive endurance, something with a different load-bearing structure beneath it. His eyes moved from the middle distance to Danner's hand on his shoulder, traveled slowly up Danner's arm to his face and held there. He said in a voice that was quieter than anything he had said so far, quieter than the situation seemed to demand, but with a weight that made the quiet itself feel architectural. take your hand off my shoulder." Danner's grip tightened reflexively. Then, in a response he would not have been able to explain if asked, a response generated not by thought, but by some precognitive alarm system that recognized on a level below language that something was deeply wrong with this situation, released. Just slightly. Not all the way. But the certainty went out of the grip. On the walking path, Evelyn Marsh had raised her phone. The small red recording light was on. She had moved 4 steps to the left to improve the angle, and she was not shaking, which was the most remarkable thing, because her heart was going like a fist against a door. But her hands were not shaking, because she had spent 30 years of her professional life deciding that she was the person who didn't look away. And retirement had not changed that. A third person had joined the gathering on the path. A young woman with earbuds pulled out, standing very still. A father with 2 small children had stopped and moved the children slightly behind him, which was not nothing. It was the precise gesture of a man deciding that what his children were about to see was something they should see from a slight distance rather than not at all. Danner's boot toe tapped once. His free hand moved toward his shoulder radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7, Bravo." Danner's voice on the radio had the elevated tempo of a man performing authority. He was no longer confident he had the words coming fractionally faster than his normal radio cadence. The pitch, a half register too high. "I need backup at Halcyon Pines Lakeside Reserve South Entrance bench area near the water." A beat of static, then the dispatcher's voice, neutral and professional. "Go ahead. 7, Bravo." Non-compliant subject. Danner set his eyes, not leaving Raymond, who sat with both hands now flat and visible on his thighs, looking at Danner with an expression of profound, patient clarity. Aggressive male refusing lawful orders, physically resisting, refusing to identify. Black male, late 60s, olive jacket, gray cap. He paused, and in the pause was the calculation of a man building a story in real time, laying the track just far enough ahead of the train. "Suspect is highly hostile. Advise responding units to use extreme caution." The radio crackled. "Copy 7, Bravo. Backup en route. Can you maintaining," Danner said. Raymond listened to all of it. He had heard false reports constructed over a radio channel before, had reviewed the body camera footage. Afterward had sat across tables from officers who had to explain the gap between what they said on the radio and what the camera showed. But there was something specifically clarifying about hearing one built in real time in front of him, word by word, while the camera on Danner's chest was recording everything, including the fact that the highly hostile subject was sitting with both hands flat on his thighs and had not raised his voice once in the entire encounter. Raymond straightened his spine, not as a performance, but as a decision, and began speaking in a clear, even voice directed not at Danner, but at the small black rectangle of the body camera mounted on Danner's chest. "For the record," Raymond said, "I am Raymond Elias Cole. I have been seated on this bench with both hands visible throughout this encounter. I have not resisted any order. I have not raised my voice. I have not committed any crime, and I have not been informed of any legal grounds for this stop." His voice was steady and unhurried, each sentence complete. "Officer Danner has demanded identification without providing legal grounds for that demand. Officer Danner has placed his hand on my shoulder without justification. Officer Danner has just reported to dispatch that I am non-compliant, aggressive, and physically resisting, none of which is accurate, all of which is documented on the camera I am speaking to." "Shut up," Danner said. But the words came out with less force than he had intended, because what Raymond was doing had no slot in the filing system that Danner's experience had built. Suspects argued. Suspects pleaded. Suspects threatened. Suspects went silent. Suspects did not narrate the encounter into the body camera with the composed precision of a man who understood exactly what evidentiary value each sentence carried. "I am stating for the record," Raymond continued, "that I am an elderly man, unarmed, sitting on a public bench, and I am currently in fear for my physical safety due to Officer Danner's conduct and the false information he has just provided to responding units." He paused. I am complying with physical demands under duress. Danner drew his taser. The bright yellow device came out of its holster with a practiced motion, and the red laser sight appeared as a small dot of light on Raymond's chest, a small vivid declaration of what came next if what had come before continued not working. "Hands on your head," Danner said. "Now." Raymond raised his hands slowly with an exaggerated deliberateness that telegraphed every millimeter of the movement and laced his fingers together on top of his gray wool cap. He looked directly at Danner over the line of the laser sight and continued speaking to the camera. "Officer Danner has drawn his taser and is pointing it at my chest, while I sit with my hands laced on top of my head in complete physical compliance," Raymond said. His voice had not gained a tremor. "Any officer responding to this call has received a description of a highly hostile subject who is physically resisting. I want the record to show that the subject they will encounter is a 69-year-old man sitting on a bench who has not moved aggressively, has not raised his voice, has not reached for anything, and has complied with every physical demand under protest." He paused. In the distance, still far but coming fast, the first sirens reached the lake and bounced off its surface, arriving from 2 directions at once. "When your shift supervisor arrives," Raymond said quietly, "you are going to need help that I genuinely hope you have access to." Danner laughed, a short, harsh sound, more air than humor. "My supervisor is Sergeant Ferrara," he said, "and he is going to be very interested in hearing how you've been making my morning difficult." Raymond said nothing, but something in his expression shifted. Not surprise, not alarm, not anything that could be easily named a small movement behind his dark eyes. That might have been recognition, might have been the grim satisfaction of a man who has just been handed information that clarifies the situation considerably. The sirens screamed closer. The laser sight dot moved slightly with Danner's unsteady hand. Amos ate corn from the ground, unhurried, his damaged foot settled at its habitual angle, entirely indifferent to the sound of approaching authority. The 3 patrol cars came through the north entrance of Halcyon Pines Lakeside Reserve with a convergent urgency that expressed itself in squealing tires and grass torn up under wheels that had not been designed for soft ground at speed, and they pulled up in a loose triangle around the south bench area, with doors opening while the vehicles were still moving and 4 officers pouring out with the practiced, slightly mechanical movements of people whose training had taken over from their individual judgment, which was what training was designed to do, and why the gap between what training assumed and what was actually present in a given situation was always the most dangerous moment in police work. The officers' hands hovered near holsters. Their eyes scanned the scene with the particular forward-leaning urgency of people who have been told through a radio call, through a fellow officer's voice, through the word highly hostile to expect violence, and who are now physically arranged to meet it. What they found was this: an elderly black man sitting on a park bench with his hands laced on top of a gray wool cap. His posture upright and completely still, a canvas bag of bird corn sitting on the bench beside him, and a worn-looking duck standing near his feet, eating scattered corn from the frost-stiffened grass. And 10 feet from this man, a younger officer holding a drawn taser with a hand that was not entirely steady, his face flushed above the collar with the specific color of someone who has been in an encounter that has not gone the way he planned and is now trying to reassemble the story into something that the arriving audience can accept. The gap between the radio description and the reality was immediate and jarring, and the 4 arriving officers felt it in the way you feel a step that isn't there in the dark. A small stomach drop of miscalibration that the training did not quite override because the training was not designed for this specific texture of wrongness. But they held their positions anyway because the training was also not designed for the moment of arrival to be the moment of reassessment, and so they formed the semicircle and kept their hands near their holsters and waited for the situation to resolve itself into a shape they had been prepared for. Danner, energized by the arrival of his colleagues the way a small fire is energized by the introduction of oxygen, raised his voice and pointed at Raymond and repeated his charges with the performance of a man who needed witnesses to his version of events more than he needed the version to be accurate. Subject refused to identify, refused lawful orders, and became physically aggressive when I attempted to conduct a welfare check, he said. I have been maintaining here pending backup. Subject is non-compliant and potentially unstable. Raymond did not move, did not respond. Kept his hands laced on top of his gray wool cap and his eyes on the middle distance above the lake, and the contrast between the volume of Danner's narration and the absolute stillness of its subject was something that at least 2 of the 4 arriving officers registered and did not know what to do with. One of them, a younger officer named Torres, who had been on the job for 8 months and whose training was the freshest and therefore most recently interrogated, noticed the duck. He noticed it because it was strange. The other ducks had retreated to the far side of the lake in a cluster near the opposite bank, putting as much distance between themselves and the arriving vehicles as the water allowed. But the large male with the visibly damaged left foot was standing 18 inches from the seated man's shoes and eating corn from the ground with the utter disregard for drama of a creature that had assessed the situation and found it below the threshold of concern. Torres had grown up around enough animals to understand that prey creatures do not remain voluntarily near sources of danger, and he filed this observation in the part of his mind where things that don't add up go to wait. Sergeant Lou Ferrara was the last out of the lead car. He was 53 years old, with 22 years on the job, and the particular kind of accumulated experience that sits in a person differently than formal knowledge. Not in the mind exactly, but in the body, in the way the eyes move across a scene in the involuntary response to information that doesn't cohere. He had graying temples and a broad face that defaulted to a patient, watchful neutrality that people sometimes mistook for indifference, and that was in fact the opposite, the deliberate suspension of judgment pending sufficient information. He took in the scene in the systematic way he had developed over 2 decades. Danner's first agitated story has a quality he has learned to distrust, hand not steady on the taser, then the gathering civilian witnesses, 3 cameras visible, 4th being raised as he watched the older black woman in the cardigan who had the particular stillness of someone who has decided they are not going anywhere, then the duck, then the man on the bench. He stopped. Not a full stop, he kept moving, but his pace changed, slowed, became the pace of a man who has encountered something that requires more careful navigation than he had prepared for. Something about the man on the bench had produced in Ferrara's mid-chest a signal that he had learned over 22 years to treat as information rather than noise, a signal that said, "Slow down, something here is different from what you've been told." Danner Ferrara said, "Lower your weapon." "Sarge." "I've been holding this scene for lower the weapon, officer." Ferrara's voice had not risen. It had, if anything, gotten quieter, and the quality of that quiet communicated something to all 4 of the other officers that was more effective than volume. Danner lowered the taser. Didn't reholster it. Ferrara had already stopped paying attention to Danner. He was looking at the man on the bench, and the man on the bench was looking back at him. And something in the quality of that gaze, its absolute stillness, its complete absence of fear or pleading, or the particular performing innocence quality of a person who knows they're innocent but doesn't know if that will be enough, was assembling in Ferrara's memory into something he couldn't quite yet name. Ferrara walked toward the bench. 3 feet, 2 feet, 1. The recognition process when it happened was not cinematic. It was not a sudden blaze of realization, the way it happens in movies, the gasp and the stepping back and the hand over the mouth. It was a slower and more terrible thing than that, a gradual assembling of pieces that each individually could have been dismissed, and that together could not be each one arriving and taking its place in a structure that was building toward a conclusion that Ferrara's mind kept trying to reject, even as the evidence kept confirming it. The bearing was the first piece. The way a man sits carries his history in it, not in the muscles exactly, but in something beneath the muscles, the embedded posture of years of authority. The particular way the spine arranges itself when it has been the spine of someone who gave orders that other people followed without question. And this arrangement persists even when the person is retired, even when they are wearing worn civilian clothes, even when they are sitting with their hands on their head in the company of a man with a taser. It is, once you have seen it enough times, unmistakable. The eyes were the second piece. Dark, intelligent, utterly, completely unafraid, not performing fearlessness the way some people do, which always has a quality of effort to it, but simply and structurally unafraid. The way a very old tree is unafraid of wind, not because it doesn't feel the wind, but because its roots go down further than the wind can reach. And these eyes were doing something that Ferrara had never had a pair of civilian eyes do to him on a scene they were assessing him. Not appealing to him, not challenging him, not performing for him. Assessing him, the way a superior officer assesses a subordinate. The face was the third piece, and the face was where the assembly accelerated past the point where it could be stopped because the face was older than the face he was trying to match it to. More silver in the close-cropped hair. More lines in the dark skin. More of the particular weight that years of impossible decisions leave on a person's face. But beneath all of that, it was the same face, and Ferrara's memory was holding it now next to an image from 18 years ago. A department briefing a new commanding officer standing before a room of patrolmen with a quality of moral authority so immediate it made you sit up straighter without knowing you were doing it. The fourth piece was small and almost peripheral. The corner of a laminated card at the breast pocket of the olive field jacket. A rectangle of institutional blue that caught the morning light at an angle that showed just barely the specific shade and format of a federal identification document. And Ferrara's mind, pulling this piece into the structure it was building, felt the structure click into completion. He stopped walking. His left foot was still slightly raised from the last step, and he put it down with great care, like a man setting something down that he has realized is fragile. The color left his face. It did not drain slowly. It left the way warmth leaves a room when a door opens in winter suddenly and entirely, and what replaced it was a grayish quality that made him look for a moment like a man who had been told very bad news. The other officers noticed Ferrara had stopped moving and exchanged the kinds of glances that people exchange when the senior person in a room does something that doesn't fit the expected pattern. Sarge Danner said. Watts Ferrara raised one hand without looking at Danner, and Danner went quiet. Ferrara stood before the bench, and the man on the bench looked up at him with the same steady, patient directness he had maintained throughout. And Ferrara looked back, and the gap between what Ferrara thought he was walking toward and what he was standing in front of was so large that for a moment neither his body nor his mind could produce an appropriate response. His mouth opened. He was aware of it opening. He was aware that his body was making a decision that his conscious mind was still catching up to. Words formed somewhere below the level of deliberate speech, coming from the place where 18 years of a particular kind of professional respect had been stored, waiting without either of them knowing it for exactly this moment to become relevant. He said a name. He said it quietly, and he said it the way you say a name when you're not entirely certain you're not imagining something, with a questioning inflection that was also an acknowledgement, the way you confirm something when confirmation is the last thing you expected to be doing. The sound of it hung in the cold morning air above the lake. Raymond Elias Cole looked at Sergeant Lou Ferrara and held his gaze for a long, steady moment. And then, with the quiet of someone completing a sentence that had been started 18 years ago, he said, "Lou." One word. A confirmation that hit the accumulated structure of Ferrara's recognition like a key hitting a lock. And the lock opened, and everything on the other side of it came through all at once. Ferrara saluted. It was not a decision. It was not a performance. It was the involuntary, absolute expression of 18 years of professional respect and a hierarchical relationship that did not end simply because one of the parties had retired, erupting through whatever surface it had been living beneath, and making itself manifest in the only language that Ferrara's training had given him for this particular feeling. It was a full formal salute, the kind you execute at change of command ceremonies and official reviews. The kind that comes from the shoulder with the elbow at the correct angle and the hand precisely positioned and the spine at attention. and it happened in a suburban park on a frost-bitten October morning with 4 other officers watching and a woman with a phone recording, and a jogger frozen in disbelief on the walking path, and its formality in that context was so total that for a moment it reorganized the meaning of everything around it. Chief Cole Ferrara said. His voice had the specific quality of a man trying to maintain professional composure while the floor is moving. "Sir? I had no idea." "I know you didn't," Lou Raymond said. He lowered his hands from his cap slowly and set them in his lap. And the act of lowering his hands, the simple unfolding of that gesture, had the quality of a man resuming something that had never actually been taken from him. He rose from the bench with the careful deliberateness of a 69-year-old body that has earned its right to move at its own pace, and the physical transformation that this rising produced in the space around him was something that each person present experienced in their own body before they had time to process it intellectually. He was not taller than Danner. He was not physically imposing in any way that a photograph would capture. He was an old man in a worn field jacket and corduroys, and he was the most authoritative presence in a 40-yard radius. And the difference between those two things was the whole story. The 3 officers who had arrived as backup had their hands completely away from their holsters now. Torres, the youngest, had taken a half-step backward without knowing he had moved. Ferrara was still in the posture of attention, his salute lowered but his spine straight with the lingering muscle memory of it. Danner stood 8 feet away. The taser was in his hand. He had not raised it, and he had not put it away, and he seemed to have temporarily lost access to the decision-making process that would resolve this, which was perhaps because the decision-making process had been running on a set of assumptions that had just been invalidated entirely and had not yet found new ground to stand on. Raymond looked at Danner. He did not speak to him. He looked at him the way a man looks at an accounting problem that has already been solved, not with anger, not with contempt, not with satisfaction, but with the complete patient focus of someone who has already done the math and is simply waiting for the numbers to stop moving. Danner's face in this look went through several things quickly. The flushed aggression gave way to something pale and uncertain, which gave way to something that was not quite recognition, but was recognition's closest neighbor. The dawning understanding that the particular confidence he had walked into this park with was built on a premise that had just been removed from beneath it, and that everything he had said and done since he put the cruiser in drive was now standing on air. The taser hit the frozen grass with a sound that was small but very clear in the silence that had settled over the bench area. Raymond turned back to Ferrara. "Sergeant," he said in a voice that had the quality of returning to business, "I need Officer Danner placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. All body camera footage from this encounter. Danner's camera, the dash cam from his cruiser, and the cameras of every officer present is to be secured and flagged for internal affairs review before noon." He paused. "I'm also requesting that this incident be referred to the Department of Justice for a civil rights review. You have sufficient reason to know why." "Yes, sir," Ferrara said. "Consider it done. And Lou." Raymond's voice dropped slightly, not for privacy, the cameras would pick it up, but with the weight of something that was not an official directive. "What just happened here has happened to a great many other people who didn't have my name. I need you to understand that. Not the incident. The pattern." Ferrara's jaw worked once. "I understand, sir." Raymond nodded once slowly. He reached down to the bench and picked up his canvas bag of cracked corn. He tossed a final handful toward the water's edge. Amos moved to the nearest kernels and ate with the unhurried dignity of a creature entirely unconcerned with the redistribution of human authority that had just occurred 6 feet above him. Evelyn Marsh, still on the path, had lowered her phone slightly, not because she had stopped recording, but because what she had just witnessed had temporarily made her hands forget they were holding something. Her face had the expression of a woman who has spent 30 years knowing that justice was possible and has just watched it happen and found that the actual experience of it was both more and less than she had expected in ways she couldn't yet put in order. She kept recording. Danner was placed in handcuffs by Ferrara with a quietness that was in some ways more devastating than any drama would have been. No raised voices, no resistance, just the procedural execution of a process that Danner had performed on other people hundreds of times, and was now experiencing from the other side the cold metal of the cuffs clicking into place with the same mechanical finality that he had always experienced as a sound of power, and that now sounded like something else entirely. His badge came off first, then the duty belt, then the sidearm which Ferrara handled with the deliberate care of an experienced officer, decommissioning a weapon from a colleague, his face professionally neutral in the way that professional neutrality can communicate more than expression. Danner watched each item being removed with the expression of a man watching something that cannot be undone, something that exists in the category of events that divide time into before and after. And he did not speak, which was perhaps the first correct decision he had made in the past 90 minutes. Raymond sat back down on the bench. He picked up the canvas bag. He tossed a handful of corn toward the water. He watched the ducks move toward it. He did not watch Danner being walked to a patrol car. Ferrara, before accompanying Danner, approached the bench and crouched to Raymond's eye level, not standing over him, not performing authority, but putting himself at a horizontal that acknowledged a relationship of a particular kind. He said something quiet, and Raymond answered with 2 words, and Ferrara nodded and reached into his jacket. Raymond reached into his breast pocket and removed the laminated card, not partially this time, but fully turning it so that Ferrara could see the entire face of it in the morning light. It was an FBI National Academy faculty identification card. Raymond's name and photograph on it. The institutional seal clear above them issued 12 years ago, and carried since then by the force of habit that makes certain objects permanent fixtures of certain pockets. Ferrara looked at it for a long moment. He looked at Raymond's face. He looked back at the card. He handed it back without a word, straightened up, and walked toward the patrol car where Danner was sitting in the back looking at nothing through the window. Evelyn came and sat beside Raymond on the bench. She did not ask how he was. She held out her hand, and he placed a handful of corn in it, and she threw it toward the water with the practiced arc of someone who had been coming to this park for years and had absorbed the technique by proximity, and they sat together in the particular silence of people who have witnessed something large and do not yet need to speak about it. 40 minutes later, Chief Gary Pullman arrived in his dress uniform, which was the first thing that told Raymond something useful about Gary Pullman, that when a situation required you to come to a park at 9 in the morning, his instinct was to dress for the cameras rather than the conversation. Pullman's apology had the architecture of a prepared statement. The careful language, the appropriate pauses, the phrases that communicated concern while simultaneously constructing a firewall around institutional liability. He was, Raymond could see, immediately more interested in managing the situation than in understanding it, which was a particular kind of failure that Raymond had spent 41 years watching chieftains of various organizations exhibit, and which always eventually made everything worse. "How many complaints did Danner have before you hired him?" Raymond asked. Pullman stopped mid-sentence. The pause that followed was its own answer. Raymond reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small notepad. He had been making calls from his kitchen table since 7:30 that morning, while Pullman was presumably still deciding which uniform buttons to polish. The calls had gone to people who owed him professional debts of one kind or another, people with access to personnel systems and the willingness to use that access for a man whose record in law enforcement was what Raymond's record was. 3 complaints in 5 years at his previous 2 departments, Raymond said, reading from the notepad with the same flat, factual delivery he would have used at a department review. All dismissed. One involved a 16-year-old black boy named Deshaun Briggs, who was thrown to the ground while walking home from school and held for 11 minutes. One involved a 34-year-old Latina woman named Carmen Reyes, whose car was searched in front of her 2 young children and found to contain nothing illegal. One involved a 72-year-old black man named Walter Odom, who was detained for 35 minutes on a public sidewalk while waiting for a bus. Raymond looked up from the notepad. 3 complaints, Gary, all involving minorities. all dismissed as insufficient evidence. All at departments that decided a transfer was easier than a formal review and sent him here with a letter praising his proactive policing style. Pullman had gone the specific gray of a man who is calculating damage in real time and finding the numbers larger than he expected. "You didn't know," Raymond said. It was not a question. "The file we received. You didn't ask," Raymond said. A 30-second phone call to his previous supervisor would have told you everything I just told you. You didn't make the call, because making the call would have meant either turning him away and finding someone else or taking him knowing what he was, and neither of those was as easy as accepting the transfer without asking questions. He put the notepad back in his pocket. And so, this morning happened. Pullman opened his mouth and closed it. "I'm going to tell you what I want," Raymond said, and his voice had the quality of a man who has already decided and is extending the courtesy of a conversation he does not strictly need to have. Full termination, not resignation. I don't want him to be able to transfer to another department in 2 counties and do this again to someone whose name doesn't stop him. All body camera footage released publicly within 48 hours. A formal referral to the DOJ. And a complete review of every officer who has been transferred into your department in the past 5 years, specifically examining complaint histories that may not have been fully communicated. Chief Washington. Chief Cole Pullman corrected himself. The media coverage from a footage release would be, "That is the point," Raymond said. He turned back to the lake. A pair of mallards had returned to the near shore, testing the situation. The morning light was higher now, warmer, beginning to burn the frost off the grass in small clouds of vapor that rose and vanished in the still air. "You have a choice to make," Gary Raymond said without turning. "You can manage this or you can change something. They're not the same thing. Only one of them makes you the person you probably believed you were when you took the job." He tossed a handful of corn. Amos moved to meet it. The video went live that evening at 7:42 p.m., posted by Evelyn Marsh to her social media accounts with a caption that contained only facts, the date, the location, the time, and 5 words. "Watch what happens next." Within 4 hours, the video had been shared 40,000 times. By midnight, it was on every major news network. The footage was damning, not in the way that shocking footage is damning with graphic content that produces a visceral response and then fades, but in the way that evidence is damning, which is quieter and more permanent. A viewer could see Raymond sitting on the bench with his hands visible, and simultaneously hear Danner's voice on the radio, describing a highly hostile and physically resisting subject, and the gap between what the camera showed and what the radio said was so wide and so clear that it required no commentary, no narration, no expert interpretation. The lie was self-evident and self-documenting, and the body camera on Danner's chest had recorded all of it, including Raymond speaking directly into that camera and listing with calm precision each thing that was happening and each claim that was false. Was when the identity of the vagrant on the bench broke, and it broke fast because several of Ferrara's officers had made phone calls to people who had made phone calls to people, which is how information travels in law enforcement communities. The story became something the media could not put down. Raymond Elias Cole, 41 years in law enforcement, retired chief of police, FBI National Academy faculty. The man who had implemented the state's most comprehensive early intervention program for problem officers, a program whose existence had not this morning prevented a problem officer from doing the thing the program was designed to prevent. The irony was so complete that it required no editorializing, and most of the media coverage was wise enough not to try. By the following morning, a counter-narrative had materialized in the corners of social media, where counter-narratives materialize a Facebook group with a name that began with Support Officer and ended with Danner's name posts claiming that Raymond had played the victim, that the whole encounter had been staged, that Danner had been doing exactly what a police officer in a safe neighborhood was supposed to do, which was protect that safety from people who threatened it, And if you couldn't see how an unfamiliar person in worn clothes on a bench constituted a reasonable basis for suspicion, then you didn't understand how the real world worked. The counter-narrative lasted approximately 36 hours. What ended it was an audio recording that surfaced on the second day, sourced by an investigative reporter who had been working the law enforcement accountability beat for a decade and had a source inside Danner's previous department who had been waiting 3 years for an opportunity to produce it. The recording was from an internal departmental hearing, and on it, Brett Danner's voice was calm and flat and entirely comfortable with what he was saying. Fear is the only thing that works with these people. Anything else is just managing them until the next time. The recording had 11 words that said everything the video had spent 8 minutes showing, and the counter-narrative collapsed under them without ceremony. Pullman held a press conference 38 hours after the incident, looking like a man who has chosen between 2 bad options and is not yet certain he chose the better one. He announced that Officer Brett Danner had been terminated, not placed on leave, not invited to resign, terminated, and that a full departmental review of transfer procedures and complaint history protocols was underway, and that the department was cooperating fully with a federal civil rights inquiry. He did not say that Raymond had given him those exact instructions 40 hours earlier, because Pullman was the kind of man who preferred to present inevitable decisions as voluntary ones, and Raymond was the kind of man who had learned not to care about that distinction. The DOJ referral went through 3 days after the incident. Investigators from the Civil Rights Division, following the footage and the complaint history and the trail of transfers, began the methodical process of reconstructing what the official record had been built to obscure not through conspiracy or deliberate coordination, but through the accumulated effect of dozens of individual decisions by dozens of individual people, each of whom had chosen the easier path, and whose easier paths had together produced a road that led to a park bench on an October morning. The investigation would take 4 months. Its findings would not be comfortable for anyone who had signed a letter of recommendation or processed a transfer without asking the question that needed to be asked. The real number, when investigators finished reaching out to community members across 3 jurisdictions, people who had never filed formal complaints because filing formal complaints had never in their experience, or in the experience of anyone they knew, resulted in anything except making yourself a target, was not 6. It was 19. 19 incidents over 7 years. 19 people who had been stopped or searched or detained or physically handled in ways that ranged from humiliating to injurious. Almost exclusively Black and Latino civilians in neighborhoods where their presence had been the only probable cause that the officer in question had needed. The phrase non-cooperative behavior appeared in Danner's own incident reports with such frequency that it functioned less as a description than as a signature, until the verbal equivalent of the boot toe tap. 3 departments, 7 years. A trail of people who had done the math on the complaint process and decided reasonably and correctly based on available evidence that the effort was not worth the outcome. Raymond's civil lawsuit against the Halcyon Pines Police Department and the municipality was filed 6 weeks after the incident and settled in under 60 days. The footage made a trial not just inadvisable but indefensible, and the city's legal counsel communicated this to the city council with the frank directness that only enormous liability produces. The settlement was $1.9 million. Raymond accepted it and kept none of it. He established a legal defense fund, which he named the Elias Cole Fund after his father, a man who had worked for 34 years maintaining the floors of a federal courthouse and who had died without ever sitting on the correct side of a courtroom in any matter that involved his own dignity. The fund was structured to provide free legal representation to civilians who had been wrongfully stopped, searched, or detained by law enforcement. Attorney fees, expert witness costs, filing. Costs, all of it covered with particular priority, given to cases involving individuals who had been formally processed or charged based on incidents that later turned out to be built on fabricated or exaggerated grounds. He released a single statement to the press about the fund. It was 4 sentences long, and the last one read, "The money belongs to the people it should have protected." There was no press conference, no ceremony, no photograph of Raymond holding a large novelty check. Within 72 hours of the statement, the fund had received an additional $680,000 in donations from private citizens, civil rights organizations, and 3 foundations dedicated to justice reform, whose names Raymond recognized and whose work he had admired from a distance for years. He acknowledged this privately in his kitchen with a cup of coffee that went cold while he read the list of donors on his laptop screen, and then he closed the laptop and went to bed. Amos, for what it is worth, was at the bench the following morning. Raymond brought extra corn. The federal courthouse was surrounded by media on the gray February morning when the trial of Brett Danner began. Satellite trucks and cameras and the specific organized chaos of a press presence that understands it is covering something that will be referenced later, cited in other contexts, turned into the kind of shorthand that legal and civil rights communities use to name a category of thing. Inside, the atmosphere was quieter and heavier, the way courtrooms always are when the weight of what is being decided presses down through the architecture. The gallery was full journalists, legal observers, representatives from civil rights organizations, and several rows of people who had no official credentials, but who had driven or taken the bus from neighborhoods that none of them could see from the courthouse steps, and who were sitting upright in the gallery chairs with the particular alertness of people for whom the outcome is not abstract. Danner at the defense table had the look of a man who had been significantly reduced by the 4 months since the park. Not just physically, though the weight he had lost was visible in the way his clothing hung, but in some quality of presence that had been built on the certainty that the system would always eventually arrange itself in his favor, and which had not survived the 4 months of evidence to the contrary. His defense attorney, experienced, meticulous, professionally impassive, kept her pen moving across her legal pad with the energy of someone who has not yet stopped believing she can find an angle. Raymond took the stand in a dark suit with the unhurried deliberateness that had characterized every public movement he made. He was sworn in. He confirmed his name and his history and his presence at the park on the morning in question with the economy of a man who has testified in court many times and understands that a witness's credibility is built in the spaces between answers as much as in the answers themselves. The prosecution took him through the encounter in sequence. His answers were precise and short. He did not editorialize. He did not moralize. He described each moment, the approach, the demands, the hand on his shoulder, the radio call, the taser with the flat specificity of a security camera that doesn't have opinions, only footage. Then the prosecutor asked Mr. Cole, "Were you afraid?" Raymond was quiet for a moment. It was not the quiet of someone who doesn't know the answer. It was the quiet of someone who is deciding how much of the truth to give and landing on all of it. "Yes," he said. He let the words stand alone for a moment before continuing. "Not of Officer Danner personally. He was a young man with poor judgment and a drawn taser, and I have been in the presence of more dangerous things than that. What I was afraid of was what happens after the radio call. What I was afraid of was the 4 officers arriving in vehicles with adrenaline and weapons who had been told they were responding to a highly hostile subject who was physically resisting and who would arrive looking for that, and who would find me, a 69-year-old man, sitting on a bench with his hands on his head, and have to decide very quickly whether the reality in front of them was going to override the story they had been given." He paused. "I have reviewed the body camera footage of too many cases where that decision went wrong. I was afraid because I knew the odds, and because knowing the odds does not change them." He looked at the jury as he said the next part. "I complied with every physical demand Officer Danner made, even the unlawful ones, because I wanted to live," Raymond said. "I was not going to let a man like Brett Danner decide how my story ended, not after 41 years of trying to make law enforcement into something worth believing in." The defense cross-examination was vigorous and technically sophisticated and ultimately futile because the video existed, and the body camera existed, and the audio of the radio call existed, and Raymond answered each question about his conduct on the morning in question, with the specific dated documented facts of his conduct on the morning in question, never arguing, never elevating his voice simply and methodically, correcting the record, and the jury watched him do this with the focused attention of people who are watching something they will not forget. Deshaun Briggs was 20 years old when he took the stand, and he had spent the 4 months since being contacted by federal investigators deciding whether he was willing to do this, and the decision had not been simple or clean, but had finally landed as he explained to his mother the night before he drove to the courthouse on the fact that he was still walking with a slight pull in his left knee from where the asphalt had ground into it 3 years ago, and he was going to have that for the rest of his life, and he thought someone should know why. He described the afternoon he had been walking home from school. His backpack, his earbuds, the late summer heat on the sidewalk, the way the patrol car had materialized behind him without any of the signals that would have told him it was coming. He described being told to stop and face the car. He described the moment the officer's hands made contact, and then the asphalt was coming up, and then it was on his face and his chest, and the weight on his back was enormous. And he knew with the complete certainty of a 16-year-old who had absorbed this knowledge from every adult in his life that the most important thing he could do right now was not move. He showed the jury the scar on his chin, faded now silvery against his dark skin. He kept his voice steady through all of it. At the end, on the last question, his voice broke once on the word scared, and he did not apologize for it, and the jury did not look away. Carmen Reyes sat at a specific angle that suggested she had thought about how she was going to sit in this chair upright, hands folded with the contained quality of a woman who has decided that the way she conducts herself in this room is itself a form of testimony. She described the parking lot in a steady voice. She described her children in the back seat. She described the sound the car door made when the officer opened it without asking, and the particular quality of her daughter's silence in the minutes after, which was the silence of a child absorbing information about the world that nobody had wanted her to have yet. She did not cry. She was in her stillness more frightening than tears would have been, more insistent, more permanent. When the defense attorney suggested that she might have misunderstood the officer's authority to conduct the search, Carmen Reyes looked at her for a moment with the expression of a woman who has had 4 years to understand exactly what authority was and was not exercised in that parking lot, and said simply, "I didn't misunderstand anything." Walter Odom was 73, and he had the unhurried quality of a man who had spent 34 years walking the same mail route, and had learned that things happen when they happen, and the best you can do is be present for them. He described the bus stop. He described putting his hands on the patrol car when he was told to. He described standing there for 35 minutes while officers who had found nothing continued to find nothing. And he described the quality of the silence in his house that evening, which was different from the usual silence in a way he had not been able to name for his wife when she asked him what was wrong. "That day I understood," Walter said, and his voice had the weight of something that had been thought about for a long time before being said, that my life was not something the law was interested in protecting. I'd been a letter carrier for 34 years. I delivered mail to a federal courthouse twice a week. And that afternoon, I understood that the building and the thing it was supposed to stand for were not the same thing. He stepped down. Raymond in the gallery had his hands on his knees. As Walter Odom passed the gallery railing, Raymond's hands pressed together briefly once and released. The jury deliberated for 3.5 hours. Guilty on all 4 counts: deprivation of rights under color of law, filing a false police report, official misconduct assault under color of law. The judge sentenced Danner to 3 years in federal prison, 2 years supervised probation, and permanent decertification from law enforcement in every jurisdiction in the country. Before she ordered him remanded, she said one sentence directly to him. Not a speech, not a lecture, just one sentence, and everyone who was there later found that it was the sentence they remembered, the one that stayed in the room after everything else had cleared. Raymond's victim impact statement was the shortest of any parties, as those who knew him had expected it to be. He ended it with, "I don't want him to suffer. I want him to understand. There's a difference." Danner was led from the courtroom. He did not look back. 1 year later, October came back to Halcyon Pines with the same unhurried inevitability it always did, and the oaks around the lake burned copper and amber in the early light, the same way they had the year before, and the year before that, and the frost needled the grass in the same way, and the lake caught the morning light and broke it into the same slow, golden plates it had always made, because the lake did not organize its behavior around what had happened beside it on a specific morning in a specific year. Raymond Elias Cole walked the path from his home to the south bench at 8:10 in the morning, canvas bag in hand, and he sat down with the careful deliberateness of a 69-year-old body that has earned its relationship with a good bench. There was a plaque on the back rail now bolted there 6 months ago, as part of the non-monetary settlement terms, a bronze rectangle with engraved text that said something about justice and dignity and the truth that rights belong to everyone. Raymond had read it once the morning it was installed and run his fingers over the letters, the way you touch something you're not sure you want. And since then he had sat with his back to it every morning facing the water, which was the direction that mattered. A few people had come by over the summer to take photographs of the plaque, and Raymond had nodded to them when they nodded to him, and they had gone on their way, and then it had just been him and the bench and the lake again. A patrol car rolled past on the gravel path. It slowed. The window came down. The officer inside was young, 24, 25, with close-cropped natural hair, and the alert, careful demeanor of someone new enough to the job that the weight of what it required was still something she was integrating, rather than something she had already integrated and buried. She had gone through the mandatory bias and de-escalation training that had become a statewide requirement in the months following the trial, and she had attended a session where a retired chief of police with a gray wool cap and a canvas bag had spoken to her cohort for 40 minutes about what authority was for and what it was not for, and she had written down one thing he said almost word for word, and had kept the page in her uniform pocket since then. She looked at the man on the bench and offered a slow, respectful nod through the open window. He returned it. "Morning, Chief," she said. "Morning, officer," he said. "Stay careful out there." "Yes, sir." The window went up. The car continued on its patrol around the lake's perimeter and disappeared behind the far tree line. Raymond turned back to the water. Evelyn came down the path 15 minutes later with Biscuit, and she stopped at the bench without asking permission and sat beside Raymond in the way of someone who has been sitting beside a person long enough that the act has become its own kind of conversation. She held out her hand without looking at him, and he put a handful of corn in it, and she threw it toward the water with the easy, practiced arc of someone who has absorbed a technique through proximity, and it scattered across the frost in a rough crescent that the nearest ducks moved toward immediately. They sat together in the silence that has nothing to prove. After a while, Evelyn said something quiet about the cold coming in early this year, and he agreed, and that was the whole of it. She stood, called Biscuit to heel, and walked on, and the sound of her footsteps on the gravel path faded and then was gone. Raymond watched the mallards sort themselves out across the scattered corn in the usual way, Reynolds at the front, Patterson circling at the edge, the unnamed circler completing her twice around, before committing to a specific kernel. He watched them the way you watch something whose patterns you know well enough that the watching is restful rather than active, a kind of moving stillness. And then Amos came. He came from the water's edge, the way he always came late. Rolling gait, damaged, left foot settling at its familiar angle, and took his position at the near edge of the corn scatter closest to the bench while the rest of the flock jostled further out. Raymond tossed an extra handful in his direction, slightly apart from the main scatter, without making a production of it, and without looking directly at the bird. Amos ate. He did not look up. He did not run. Raymond held the canvas bag in both hands for a moment. The worn canvas had the texture of many mornings and many handfuls and many quiet returns to the same bench, and it was heavy in the way of things that have accumulated meaning slowly and without announcement. The sun was fully up now, and its light on the lake was no longer the thin gold of early morning, but something warmer and less tentative, the light of a day that had decided to be fully itself. He tossed the last handful toward the water and watched the ripples move outward from where the corn hit the surface one after another, spreading in slow, widening circles past the ducks and the far grass, and out toward the center of the lake further than he could see, further than it mattered to follow. He did not look at the plaque. He had said what needed to be said. The water would carry the rest. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that justice is worth fighting for, that one person's refusal to be erased can change more than we expect, please share it and subscribe to our channel. Every story we tell is a story that matters.